Hello, and welcome to the Long Shadow. On the morning of September 20th, 1187, a man stood before the walls of Jerusalem and saw the impossible made flesh. Saladin, Sultan of Egypt and Syria, gazed up at the massive stone fortifications that had defied Muslim armies for 88 years. Behind those walls lay the city that haunted the dreams of every ruler in the Islamic world, the place where prophets had walked and where, Muslims believed, the final judgment would one day unfold. To reclaim it would be to reverse the greatest humiliation in living memory. To fail would be to join the long list of those who had tried and been broken against its gates. What made this moment extraordinary was not the size of his army. Impressive though it was the man himself. Saladin was not born a prince. No royal blood ran in his veins. He had inherited no throne, no ancient claim to legitimacy. He was a Kurd in a world dominated by Arabs and Turks, the son of a soldier who had spent his youth not seeking glory but hoping to avoid it. Yet through a combination of circumstance, brilliance, and a ruthlessness he rarely allowed others to see, he had unified a fractured Islamic world that had spent decades tearing itself apart. He commanded an empire that stretched from the Nile to the Euphrates, and now he stood at the threshold of his greatest triumph. But before we journey to that moment of destiny, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It's a simple way to support the work, and it means a great deal to me. I'm also always curious to know where in the world and at what time you're joining me tonight, so I'd love to hear from you in the comments. And now, settle in. Let the noise of the modern world fade away, and let us travel back to an age of dust and steel, of sacred oaths and bitter rivalries, to the story of a man who changed the course of history. How did Saladin rise from obscurity to become the most feared and respected ruler of his age? How did a reluctant soldier become the commander who recaptured Jerusalem? And why, despite achieving immortal fame, did he die owning almost nothing, his body worn out at 55, his empire already beginning to fracture? Tonight, we will follow the complete arc of his life, from his birth in a fortress on the Tigris River to his death in a quiet room in Damascus. We will watch him navigate treacherous political waters, outmaneuver rivals who had every advantage, and face the greatest warrior king of Christendom in a struggle that neither could truly win. This is a story of faith and ambition, of mercy and calculation, of a man who became a legend in his own lifetime and has never been forgotten. The siege of Jerusalem in 1187 was the pinnacle. The armies were arrayed, the outcome seemingly inevitable. Saladin's forces surrounded the city. Inside, a desperate garrison prepared for a siege they knew they could not win. The Crusader field army had been annihilated 2 months earlier at the Horns of Hattin. No relief was coming. The city would fall. It was only a question of how, and at what cost. Saladin knew that every eye in the Muslim world and beyond was watching. What he did next would define not just his reign, but his legacy for all time. But this moment of triumph was the culmination of a journey that began in a very different world. One where the idea that a Kurdish soldier's son might one day dictate terms to Christian kings would have seemed absurd. The exact date of Saladin's birth is lost to history, somewhere in the years 1137 or 1138, but the place is certain: the fortress city of Tikrit, perched on the banks of the Tigris River in what is now Iraq. He was born Yusuf ibn Ayyub, a name that meant simply Joseph, son of Job. His family were Kurds, a people who occupied a complex position in the medieval Islamic world. They were neither Arab nor Turkish, the two groups who dominated political power, but they had a reputation as fierce mountain warriors and loyal soldiers. For a family with ambition but no noble lineage, military service was the surest path to advancement. Saladin's father, Najm ad-Din Ayyub, served as the military governor of Tikrit under the Seljuk Turkish authorities. His uncle, Asad ad-Din Shirkuh, was a soldier of growing reputation, known for his tactical skill and his imposing physical presence. Both men served the Zengid dynasty, the Turkish ruling family that controlled much of northern Syria and upper Mesopotamia. It was a world of shifting loyalties and constant low-level warfare, where a commander's fortunes could change with a single battle or a ruler's whim. The family's position was respectable but precarious. When Saladin was still an infant, that precarious position collapsed. His father became embroiled in a political dispute with the governor of Mosul and was forced to flee to Tikrit. The family sought refuge with Imad ad-Din Zengi, the most powerful Muslim ruler of the age, who controlled Aleppo and Mosul. Zengi accepted them into his service, and the family's fortunes were tied to the Zengid dynasty from that moment forward. After Zengi's assassination in 1146, Saladin's father and uncle continued to serve his son, Nur ad-Din, who would become the dominant figure in Saladin's early life. The family eventually settled in Damascus, the ancient city that would become the centre of Saladin's world. In the 12th century, Damascus was one of the jewels of the Islamic world, a city of gardens and flowing water, of libraries and madrasas where scholars debated theology and law. The great Umayyad Mosque stood at its heart, a monument to the city's deep history. Through its markets flowed goods from every corner of the known world, spices from India, silk from China, slaves from the steppes, steel from Persia. It was a city that valued learning as much as martial prowess. Young Yusuf received the education appropriate to his station. He memorized the Quran and studied the Hadith, the reported sayings and actions of the Prophet Muhammad. He learned Arabic grammar and poetry, subjects considered essential for any educated man. He trained in horsemanship and the use of weapons, preparing for the military career expected of him. But his father's ambition for him was not primarily martial. Ayyub hoped his son would become an administrator, a man of learning and governance rather than a battlefield commander. It was a respectable, safer path than the life of a soldier. But to the west of Damascus, a threat loomed that would eventually pull Saladin into a very different destiny. The Crusader kingdoms, established after the shock of the First Crusade in 1099, controlled a long strip of territory along the Mediterranean coast. The Kingdom of Jerusalem, the County of Tripoli, the Principality of Antioch. These were splinters driven into the heart of the Islamic world, a constant reminder of the Muslims' humiliating failure to prevent their establishment. For nearly half a century they had endured. Saladin's father wanted him to be an administrator, not a warrior. But fate, and his uncle Shirkuh, had other plans entirely. To understand how Saladin could rise to power, we must first understand why the Islamic world was so vulnerable to the Crusades in the first place. The answer lies in a story of fragmentation and bitter division that had been unfolding for more than a century. At the height of its power in the 9th and 10th centuries, the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad had ruled an empire that stretched from Spain to Central Asia, a unified political and religious authority that commanded the loyalty of most of the Muslim world. But by the time of Saladin's birth, that unity was a distant memory. The caliphs in Baghdad retained religious prestige but almost no real power. They were puppets of whatever Turkish military dynasty happened to control the city at any given moment. Political authority had shattered into dozens of rival kingdoms, sultanates, and emirates, each pursuing its own interests and viewing its neighbours with suspicion. The most powerful force in the region during Saladin's youth was the Great Seljuk Empire, a Turkish dynasty that had swept out of Central Asia in the 11th century and briefly reunited much of the Islamic world under its rule. But the Seljuks too had fragmented. By the 1130s the empire had splintered into rival branches. The Seljuks of Rum in Anatolia, the Seljuks of Iraq and Persia, and numerous smaller dynasties carved out by ambitious generals and governors. The Zengid dynasty that Saladin's family served was itself a product of this fragmentation, founded by a Seljuk military commander who had established his own power base in northern Syria. But the deepest division in the Islamic world was not political, it was religious. The great schism between Sunni and Shia Muslims, which had its roots in a 7th century dispute over the Prophet Muhammad's rightful successors, had hardened into two distinct religious and political communities. The Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad represented Sunni Islam and claimed legitimacy as the heirs of the Prophet's companions. But in Egypt, a rival caliphate had existed for nearly 2 centuries. The Fatimid Caliphate claimed descent from Fatima, the Prophet's daughter, and represented the Ismaili branch of Shia Islam. The Fatimids rejected the Abbasid claim to religious authority entirely. To them, the Abbasids were usurpers. To the Abbasids, the Fatimids were heretics. This was not a disagreement that could be negotiated away. It was a fundamental contest over the soul of Islam itself. Into this fractured world had come the Crusaders. In 1095, Pope Urban II had called for a holy war to reclaim Jerusalem from Muslim rule. The response from Christian Europe was overwhelming. In 1099, after a brutal siege, the Crusaders had captured Jerusalem and established the Kingdom of Jerusalem along with 3 other Crusader states: the County of Edessa, the Principality of Antioch, and the County of Tripoli. These Latin Christian kingdoms were foreign bodies, implanted in the Levant, sustained by a constant trickle of reinforcements and pilgrims from Europe. They were militarily formidable, their knights and heavy cavalry a match for any Muslim army. And they had endured for nearly 90 years because the Muslim world could not unite against them. This was the challenge that Nur ad-Din, the son of Zengi, and the ruler Saladin's family served, had set himself to overcome. Nur ad-Din was a man of genuine religious conviction who saw the Crusader presence not just as a political problem, but as a spiritual crisis. He believed that the only way to reclaim Jerusalem was to first unite the Muslim lands of Syria and Egypt. Only then would there be sufficient power to drive the Crusaders into the sea. It was a vision of breathtaking ambition. Syria and Egypt had not been united under a single ruler for generations, and the obstacle to unity was not military. It was the Fatimid Caliphate in Cairo. Egypt was weak, its Fatimid rulers enfeebled and barely clinging to power, but it was strategically vital. To control Egypt was to control the richest agricultural land in the region, the grain that fed cities and armies. Nur ad-Din needed Egypt, and to take it, he would send his greatest general, Asad ad-Din Shirkuh, and the young Saladin, still in his 20s, would reluctantly follow his uncle into a war that would change his life forever. In the year 1164, when Saladin was approximately 26 years old, Nur ad-Din made his move on Egypt. The Fatimid Caliphate was in the final stages of collapse. The Caliph was a powerless figurehead. Real authority rested with the Vizier, the chief minister, and rival factions at the Fatimid court were locked in a deadly struggle for control. One faction, desperate to maintain power, made a catastrophic decision. They invited the Crusaders to intervene. An army from the Kingdom of Jerusalem marched on Cairo, ostensibly to protect the Fatimid government, but in reality to extract tribute and establish dominance. Nur ad-Din saw his opportunity. He dispatched his uncle Shirkuh with an army to counter the Crusader threat and, if possible, to seize control of Egypt for himself. Shirkuh insisted that his nephew accompany him. According to the chronicles written years later, Saladin was deeply reluctant. He had no desire to leave the comforts and intellectual life of Damascus for the brutal uncertainties of a military campaign. One source records him saying that going to Egypt felt like being dragged to his death. Whether this reflects genuine reluctance or is a literary device to emphasize his later transformation, we cannot know for certain. But it is clear that at this stage of his life, Saladin was not seeking military glory. He was a skilled horseman and competent with weapons, but he had never commanded men in battle. He was, by all accounts, more comfortable with books than with swords. The situation in Egypt was as complex as it was chaotic. 3 forces were now struggling for control: the Fatimid court factions, the Crusader army from Jerusalem, and Shirkuh's Zengid expeditionary force. Alliances shifted constantly. At one point, Shirkuh and the Crusaders both claimed to be protecting the Fatimid caliph from the other. The campaign became a series of manoeuvres and skirmishes rather than decisive battles. Shirkuh's greatest strength was his mobility. He moved his army rapidly, avoiding pitched battles with the heavily armoured Crusader knights, while seeking advantageous positions. It was during this campaign that Saladin first demonstrated the tactical mind that would make his reputation. When Shirkuh's army was cornered near Alexandria, he entrusted Saladin with command of the rearguard, the most dangerous position in a retreating army. Saladin held his position, conducted a disciplined withdrawal, and prevented the force from being destroyed. It was not a glorious victory, but it was proof of competence under pressure. Shirkuh began to rely on his nephew more heavily. The first Egyptian campaign ended inconclusively. Unable to decisively defeat each other, and unwilling to commit to a protracted war, all parties eventually withdrew. Shirkuh and Saladin returned to Damascus. But the situation in Egypt remained unstable, and everyone knew they would return. Egypt was too valuable, its strategic position too critical to be left in chaos. In 1167, Nur ad-Din ordered a second expedition. Once again Shirkuh commanded, and once again Saladin accompanied him. This campaign followed a similar pattern: manoeuvre, skirmish, temporary alliances with Egyptian factions, and an eventual stalemate. But Saladin's role was expanding. He commanded larger contingents of troops and participated in negotiations with Egyptian officials. His reputation grew despite the campaign's inconclusive result. By the time they withdrew from Egypt for the second time, he was no longer merely Shirkuh's nephew. He was a recognized commander in his own right. Egypt's chaos would pull them back a third time in 1169, and this time neither uncle nor nephew would leave. One of them would die there. The other would become the most powerful man in the country. The third Egyptian campaign began in late 1168 with a new urgency. The Crusader king Amalric I of Jerusalem had launched his own invasion of Egypt, besieging the city of Bilbais and massacring its population when it fell. The atrocity shocked the Fatimid court and forced them to turn once again to Nur ad-Din for protection. This time Shirkuh arrived not as an opportunistic invader, but as a requested ally. It made all the difference. Shirkuh's army marched south from Damascus in December of 1168. The campaign was swift and decisive. The Crusaders, unable to sustain a prolonged siege of Cairo and facing a fresh, well-supplied army, withdrew before a major battle could take place. Shirkuh entered Cairo in triumph in January of 1169. The grateful but desperate Fatimid caliph, a young man named al-Adid, appointed Shirkuh as his vizier, the highest administrative office in Egypt. After 3 attempts over 5 years, the Zengid dynasty finally controlled the throne of power in Egypt. Shirkuh's vizierate lasted exactly 2 months. In March of 1169, he died suddenly. Some sources suggest he succumbed to a combination of illness and his legendary appetite. Chroniclers describe him as enormously obese, a man who could consume astonishing quantities of food in a single sitting. Whatever the cause, his death created an immediate crisis. Who would replace him? The Fatimid court was filled with ambitious officials who saw the Vizier as their prize. Shirkuh's own officers, hardened Turkish and Kurdish military commanders, assumed one of their senior members would take the position. To nearly everyone's surprise, the choice fell on Saladin. He was only 31 years old, young for such a position. He was Shirkuh's nephew, which gave him a familial claim, but he was not the most senior officer in the army. The chronicles suggest that the Fatimid courtiers chose him precisely because they believed he would be weak and easy to control. They saw a bookish young man, a capable subordinate but not a commanding presence. They thought they could manage him while they consolidated their own power. They could not have been more mistaken. Saladin's position was almost impossibly precarious. He was a Sunni Muslim commanding a military force in the capital of a Shia caliphate. He served, in theory, two masters, the Fatimid Caliph al-Adid in Cairo, who had formally appointed him, and Nur ad-Din in Damascus, whose army Saladin actually commanded. Both would grow to see him as a threat. The Fatimid court resented his presence, and the foreign soldiers he brought with him. Nur ad-Din, who had intended Egypt to be a province of his empire, watched nervously as his vassal accumulated power far from his direct control. Saladin wrote to his father in the months after assuming the vizierate. The letter, preserved by later chroniclers, conveys his sense of being overwhelmed. "I am in a position I never sought. The burden is heavier than I can bear." Whether this was genuine anguish or calculated humility meant to reassure Nur ad-Din, it captures the reality of his situation. He had power, but it was fragile. One misstep, one failed gamble, and he would be destroyed. Yet within 2 years he would transform this fragile, contested authority into something far more formidable. He would abolish a caliphate that had endured for more than 2.5 centuries. He would make himself the unchallenged ruler of the wealthiest country in the region, and he would do it while maintaining, at least outwardly, the fiction of loyalty to Nur ad-Din. Saladin held power in Egypt, but he served two masters, the Fatimid Caliph in Cairo and Nur ad-Din in Damascus. Both would soon see him as a threat, and the delicate balancing act he was forced to perform would test every ounce of his political skill. The years 1169 to 1171 were a masterclass in political survival. Saladin occupied the most dangerous position imaginable, a Sunni general in command of a foreign army, serving a Shia caliph in a hostile court, while nominally answering to a distant overlord who watched his every move with growing suspicion. A less skilled operator would have been destroyed within months. Saladin not only survived, but quietly, systematically dismantled every threat to his authority. The Fatimid Caliph, al-Adid, was young, perhaps in his early 20s, and he was dying. The sources suggest he suffered from some wasting illness, though the exact nature is unclear. Real power had long since passed from the caliphs to their viziers, and al-Adid was no exception. He was a figurehead, surrounded by a court that despised Saladin and the Turkish and Kurdish soldiers who now controlled their city. The courtiers schemed constantly, searching for a way to rid themselves of this foreign presence. Saladin's solution was elegant and ruthless. He replaced them. One by one, Egyptian officials who owed their loyalty to the old Fatimid system were removed from their posts and replaced with men loyal to Saladin personally. He brought his own family from Damascus. His father, Najm ad-Din Ayyub, was given control of the finances. His brothers were appointed to military commands. His nephews and cousins filled administrative positions. It was a deliberate strategy of colonization, transforming the Egyptian government from within. The Fatimid state structure remained, but its skeleton was now inhabited by Saladin's people. Resistance was inevitable. In August of 1169, just months after Saladin took power, a revolt erupted among the Sudanese palace guards who had served the Fatimid caliphs for generations. These soldiers, many of them former slaves who had risen to positions of influence, saw Saladin as a usurper. They attempted to overthrow him and restore Egyptian control over Egyptian affairs. Saladin crushed the revolt with swift brutality. His Kurdish and Turkish troops stormed the rebels' positions. The leaders were executed, and the surviving Sudanese soldiers were expelled from Cairo. It was a clear message. Resistance would not be tolerated. The external threat came later that same year. A combined Crusader and Byzantine fleet launched an invasion, landing an army that besieged the port city of Damietta. It was a serious threat. If Damietta fell, the invasion could push inland toward Cairo. Saladin marched his army north and fortified the city's defences. The siege dragged on for 50 days before the attackers, battered by disease and unable to break through the walls, withdrew. Saladin's victory enhanced his reputation. He was no longer merely Shirkuh's nephew, he was the defender of Egypt. But every success in Egypt made Nur ad-Din more anxious. Letters flowed between Damascus and Cairo, carefully worded but heavy with subtext. Nur ad-Din sent orders and requests for money and troops. Saladin complied with some, delayed others, and found reasons to refuse still others. He never openly defied his overlord, but he also never fully obeyed. He began fortifying Cairo, constructing a massive citadel on a hill overlooking the city. Officially, it was to protect Egypt from future Crusader attacks. In reality, it was a stronghold that could be defended against any enemy, including an army from Damascus. Nur ad-Din's letters grew sharper. He summoned Saladin to Damascus to report in person. Saladin sent apologies and excuses. Egypt was not yet secure. The Crusaders might attack again. His presence was required. The excuses were plausible, but everyone understood the truth. Saladin was building his own independent power base, and Nur ad-Din could do nothing about it without provoking a civil war that might destroy everything he had worked to build. Then, in September of 1171, the Fatimid Caliph al-Adid died after a long illness. For 262 years, the Fatimid dynasty had ruled Egypt and claimed to be the true leaders of the Muslim world. Now, with the Caliph dead and his line extinguished, Saladin faced the most consequential decision of his career: acknowledge the Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad, ending Fatimid rule forever, or maintain the fiction of Fatimid legitimacy to avoid provoking Nur ad-Din's suspicions. On the first Friday after al-Adid's death in September of 1171, the congregations of Cairo gathered for the weekly communal prayer. In mosques across the city, the Khatib, the prayer leader, stood before the assembled faithful and recited the khutbah, the sermon that included prayers for the ruler. For 262 years, those prayers had been offered in the name of the Fatimid Caliph. On this Friday, the words changed. The khutbah was recited in the name of al-Mustadi, the Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad. With a single liturgical act, Saladin abolished the Fatimid Caliphate and brought Egypt back into the Sunni fold. It was a seismic shift in the religious and political landscape of the Islamic world. The Fatimids had been more than a dynasty. They represented an entire branch of Islam, a rival claim to legitimate authority that challenged the Sunni consensus. Their caliphs had claimed descent from the Prophet Muhammad through his daughter Fatima, a lineage that gave them immense prestige among Shia communities. By ending the Fatimid line and acknowledging the Abbasid Caliph, Saladin was declaring that Egypt was now a Sunni state. The Ismaili Shia population of Cairo, who had supported the Fatimids, were now a powerless minority. Nur ad-Din's reaction was a mixture of satisfaction and concern. He had long wanted to end Fatimid rule, and Saladin had accomplished it. The religious unification of Egypt and Syria under Sunni authority was a crucial step toward his larger goal of reclaiming Jerusalem. But the very success of his vizier made him uneasy. Saladin now controlled the wealthiest province in the region. His army was loyal to him personally, not to Nur ad-Din, and he showed no sign of returning to Damascus or relinquishing authority to a governor Nur ad-Din might appoint. Saladin continued his methodical consolidation of power. He fortified Cairo's defences, completing the massive citadel that would dominate the city for centuries. He reorganised the Egyptian army, replacing the old Fatimid military units with regiments of Kurdish, Turkish, and Arab soldiers who had no loyalty to the deposed dynasty. He secured control of Upper Egypt, sending expeditions south to ensure that no remnant of Fatimid resistance could establish itself in the provinces. And he opened the treasuries of the Fatimid caliphs, using the accumulated wealth to pay his soldiers and build support among the population through public works and charitable distributions. Letters continued to pass between Cairo and Damascus. Nur ad-Din's tone grew more insistent. He demanded that Saladin send the wealth of the Fatimid treasuries north to Syria to fund campaigns against the Crusaders. Saladin sent some, but kept most. Nur ad-Din summoned him repeatedly to Damascus. Saladin replied with elaborate apologies and explanations. He was still consolidating control. The Crusaders remained a threat on Egypt's borders. His father was ill and needed him. The excuses multiplied, but the message was clear. Saladin was not coming. By 1173, Nur ad-Din's patience was exhausted. He began assembling an army in Damascus with the clear intention of marching on Egypt. The sources differ on his precise motives. Some suggest he intended merely to remind his vizier who held ultimate authority. Others believe he planned to remove Saladin entirely and install a more compliant governor. We will never know. The confrontation that might have shattered the fragile unity of the Muslim Levant never occurred. In May of 1174, Nur ad-Din fell ill in Damascus. Within days he was dead. He was 56 years old. His death was sudden enough that some chroniclers suspected poison, though no evidence supports the claim. What mattered was the consequence. The most powerful Muslim ruler in the region was gone, and he left behind an 11-year-old son as his heir. Saladin, the servant who'd been on the verge of being brought to heel, was suddenly the most powerful man in the Muslim world, and he had no intention of remaining anyone's vassal. Nur ad-Din's death in May of 1174 transformed the political landscape of the Levant overnight. His heir was his son, Salih Ismail al-Malik, a boy of just 11 years. The Zengid Empire that Nur ad-Din had spent decades building, an empire that stretched from Mosul in the east to Damascus in the west, now rested in the hands of a child who had never commanded an army or navigated the treacherous currents of Islamic politics. A regent was appointed in Aleppo to govern in the boy's name and hold the fractious empire together. But everyone who understood power knew the truth. The Zengid state was vulnerable, and ambitious men would move quickly to exploit the situation. Saladin was the most ambitious of them all. Within weeks of Nur ad-Din's death, he began positioning himself not as a usurper, but as a protector. He sent letters to Aleppo declaring his loyalty to the young As-Salih and his determination to defend the boy's inheritance. He portrayed himself as the dutiful servant stepping forward in a time of crisis to prevent the empire from collapsing into chaos. It was a masterful piece of political theatre. Saladin understood that openly seizing power would unite every Muslim ruler against him. But if he claimed to be acting in the interest of the Zengid dynasty, he could divide his opponents and portray resistance to his authority as disloyalty to the legitimate heir. In October of 1174, Saladin marched north from Egypt with his army. His stated goal was to protect Syria from Crusader aggression and to ensure the stability of As-Salih's realm. His actual goal was to take Damascus. The city that had been the centre of Nur ad-Din's power was now leaderless and vulnerable. Saladin had lived there as a young man. He knew its politics, its leading families, and its garrison commanders. When his army appeared outside the gates, there was no siege, no battle, no bloodshed. The city opened its gates and welcomed him. Some chronicles suggest the population genuinely believed he was there to protect them. Others hint that key officials had been bribed or promised positions in the new order. Either way, Damascus fell into Saladin's hands without resistance. The transformation was complete. The Kurdish soldier who had reluctantly followed his uncle to Egypt a decade earlier was now the master of the two wealthiest provinces in the Muslim Levant. He controlled Egypt's agricultural riches and Damascus's strategic position. He commanded the loyalty of a large, experienced army, and he did it all while maintaining the fiction that he served the Zengid boy king in Aleppo. But the fiction fooled no one who mattered. The Zengid family saw Saladin exactly as he was, an opportunistic usurper who had stolen their inheritance while their patriarch's body was barely cold. The regent in Aleppo denounced him as a traitor. The Zengid rulers of Mosul, who controlled the eastern portion of the old empire, refused to recognize his authority. Letters circulated among Muslim rulers throughout the region, warning that Saladin was a dangerous upstart who threatened the established order. If he could betray Nur ad-Din's dynasty, whom he had served for years, what loyalty could anyone expect from him? Saladin's response was to wrap himself ever more tightly in the language of jihad. He claimed that his only goal was to unite the Muslim forces of Egypt and Syria so they could finally reclaim Jerusalem from the Crusaders. He argued that petty dynastic disputes were a distraction from the sacred duty all Muslims shared. The Crusader kingdoms, he insisted, could only be defeated if the Muslims put aside their divisions and accepted unified command. It was a compelling argument, and it had the advantage of being partly true, but it was also a justification for conquest, a way to frame his ambition as piety. Saladin now controlled Egypt and Damascus, but the other Muslim rulers saw him as he truly was, an ambitious Kurd seizing power in the chaos. And they would resist him for the next decade in a series of bitter wars that would consume far more of his energy than fighting Crusaders ever did. The great irony of Saladin's career is that from 1174 to 1186, he spent far more time fighting fellow Muslims than he ever spent fighting Crusaders. For 12 years, he waged nearly continuous warfare against the very people he claimed to be uniting. The Zengid rulers of Aleppo and Mosul, the emirs of smaller Syrian cities, and even the secretive Nizari Ismaili assassins all stood in his path. Each conquest was justified in the name of eventual jihad against the Crusaders, but the immediate reality was Muslim blood spilled by Muslim hands. The primary resistance came from the Zengid heartlands. The rulers of Aleppo, governing in the name of the boy king as-Salih, viewed Saladin as a usurper and a traitor to Nur ad-Din's memory. They were not wrong. Saladin had served Nur ad-Din, benefited from his patronage, and risen to power under his protection. Now he was dismantling the dynasty Nur ad-Din had built. The Zengids of Mosul, who controlled the wealthy cities of Upper Mesopotamia, also refused to submit. They saw themselves as the legitimate heirs of the Zengid legacy, and regarded Saladin as an upstart with no claim to authority beyond military force. The conflict turned violent almost immediately. Saladin besieged Aleppo in late 1174, but failed to take the city. Its fortifications were formidable, and the population remained loyal to the Zengid name. He withdrew and turned his attention to smaller cities that could be isolated and pressured into submission. Homs fell to him in 1175. Hama followed soon after. Each city that submitted strengthened his position and isolated those that resisted. But the sieges were costly in men, money and time, and they did nothing to advance the cause of fighting the Crusaders, who watched the Muslim civil war with satisfaction and relief. It was during this period that Saladin faced the most direct threat to his life. The Nizari Ismailis, known in the West as the Assassins, were a Shia sect that controlled a network of mountain fortresses in Syria. They were renowned for their use of political murder as a tool of statecraft. Their fighters, often young men promised paradise for their sacrifice, would infiltrate enemy courts and camps to kill targeted leaders. The Assassins had their own reasons to oppose Saladin. He was a Sunni consolidating power in a region where they had operated with relative freedom. His rise threatened their independence. In 1175, assassin agents infiltrated Saladin's military camp near Aleppo. They came disguised as soldiers and managed to get close to his tent. One of them struck at Saladin with a dagger. The blow was deflected by Saladin's mail coif, the chainmail hood that protected his head and neck. His guards cut down the attacker, but the message was clear. He was not safe even in the heart of his own army. A second attempt came in 1176, this time intercepted before the killers could reach him. After the second attempt, Saladin became more cautious. He slept in a specially constructed wooden tower within his camp. He rotated his guards frequently, and eventually he negotiated a truce with the assassin leadership. It was a pragmatic arrangement. They would stop trying to kill him, and he would leave their fortresses alone. The campaign to take Aleppo dragged on for years. The city finally fell in 1183, nearly a decade after Saladin had first marched into Syria. The younger Saleh, the Zengid heir Saladin had once claimed to protect, had died in 1181 at the age of 18. With the boy's death, even the fiction of Saladin serving the Zengid dynasty evaporated. He now ruled openly in his own name. Mosul remained independent, refusing to acknowledge his authority, but it no longer posed an active military threat. By 1186, Saladin controlled a unified realm stretching from the Nile to the Euphrates. But the cost had been enormous. 12 years of nearly constant campaigning had exhausted his treasury and worn down his armies. Contemporary chronicles record his growing weariness and his private doubts about the necessity of the bloodshed. He was now approaching 50 years old, an advanced age by medieval standards, and his health was beginning to fail. He had barely fought the Crusaders at all, signing truces with them to free his hands for wars against Muslims. And then, in the winter of 1186, the Crusaders made a catastrophic mistake that would hand Saladin the justification he needed to finally turn his unified armies westward. Reynald of Chatillon was exactly the kind of man who made peace impossible. A minor French nobleman who had come east during the Second Crusade, he had carved out a career through audacity, violence, and a complete disregard for the conventions that allowed Crusaders and Muslims to coexist during periods of truce. He had once been Prince of Antioch through marriage, but after being captured by Muslim forces and spending 16 years in a prison in Aleppo, he had emerged hardened and bitter. By the 1180s, he controlled the fortress of Kerak in the harsh hills east of the Dead Sea. From that stronghold, he terrorized the trade routes that connected Egypt to Syria and launched raids that violated every truce his own king signed. Reynald's provocations were legendary. He had once attempted to launch a naval raid down the Red Sea toward Mecca itself, the holiest city in Islam. The plan was madness, a logistical nightmare that ultimately failed, but the mere attempt was seen as an unforgivable sacrilege. He attacked pilgrimage caravans travelling to Mecca, seizing goods and holding Muslims for ransom. He seemed to delight in violating the rules of war, in pushing boundaries simply to see what he could get away with. King Guy of Jerusalem, the weak and indecisive ruler of the Crusader kingdom, could not or would not control him. Reynald's castle at Kerak was too remote, his personality too defiant, and his military reputation too valuable. So the raids continued, and the truces signed between Saladin and the Kingdom of Jerusalem became meaningless. In the winter of 1186 to 1187, a massive caravan was travelling from Cairo to Damascus. It carried trade goods, pilgrims, and possibly members of Saladin's own extended family. The sources are unclear and contradictory. Some later chroniclers claim Saladin's sister was among the travellers, though this is disputed by modern historians. What is certain is that the caravan was enormous, wealthy, and travelling during a period of official truce between Saladin and the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Reynold, from his fortress at Kerak, launched a raid and captured the entire caravan. Hundreds of people were taken prisoner. The goods were seized. When news reached Saladin, his response was immediate and personal. He sent envoys to King Guy demanding the release of the prisoners and reparations for the violation of the truce. Guy, to his credit, tried. He sent orders to Reynold to release the captives and return the stolen goods. Reynold refused with contempt. He reportedly told the king's messengers that if Saladin wanted the prisoners, he could come and take them. It was an act of astonishing recklessness, but it was entirely in character. Saladin's reaction marked a turning point. For years he had justified his wars against fellow Muslims by claiming that unity was necessary to wage jihad against the Crusaders. But those wars had consumed his energy and delayed any real confrontation with the Crusader kingdoms. Now, finally, he had both the unified realm he had sought and a clear, undeniable provocation that would resonate with every Muslim who heard of it. In the spring of 1187, Saladin made a public vow. He swore before witnesses that he would personally execute Reynold of Chatillon with his own hands. Then he issued a call to jihad, summoning the military forces of Egypt, Syria, and the vassal states under his control. The time for truces and negotiations was over. By the summer of 1187, Saladin had assembled the largest Muslim army seen in the Levant in generations, and the Crusaders, divided, overconfident, and led by a king who could not control his own vassals, marched out to meet him in the barren, waterless hills of Galilee. In early July of 1187, the Crusader army assembled at the springs of Sapharia in Galilee, one of the few reliable sources of water in the region. It was the largest field army the Kingdom of Jerusalem had ever mustered. Perhaps 1,200 knights in full armour, several thousand mounted sergeants and lighter cavalry, and close to 10,000 infantry. The army also carried with it the True Cross, the most sacred relic in the Crusader kingdoms, believed to be a fragment of the actual cross on which Christ was crucified. Its presence was meant to inspire the soldiers and invoke divine protection. The army's commander was King Guy of Jerusalem, a man who owed his throne more to marriage and political manoeuvring than to military skill. Saladin's strategy was elegant. Rather than attack the Crusader army directly while it held a strong defensive position near water, he besieged the town of Tiberias on the shore of the Sea of Galilee. Tiberias was held by the wife of Raymond of Tripoli, one of the most powerful Crusader lords. The siege was a provocation designed to force the Crusaders to abandon their advantageous position and march to relieve the town. Raymond himself, understanding the trap, argued against marching. He told King Guy that Tiberias could be retaken later, but if the army was destroyed, the entire kingdom would fall. It was sound advice. Guy initially agreed. But that night, Reynold of Chatillon and Gerard de Riedfort, the Grand Master of the Knights Templar, pressured the king. They called Raymond a coward and accused him of allowing his own wife to be abandoned. They argued that the army's honour depended on marching to her rescue. Guy, indecisive and easily swayed, reversed his decision. At dawn on July 3rd, the Crusader army broke camp and began the march toward Tiberias. It was a fatal mistake. The route to Tiberias crossed nearly 20 miles of barren, rocky hills. The July sun was merciless. There was no water along the route, and the plan was to reach Tiberias and its lake in a single day's march. but Saladin had positioned his forces perfectly. His mounted archers harassed the Crusader column from the moment it left Safaria, raining arrows on the infantry and forcing the knights to slow their pace to protect them. The march became a grinding ordeal. By late afternoon, it was clear they would not reach water before nightfall. King Guy ordered the army to make camp on a plateau near a pair of rocky outcrops known as the Horns of Hattin. The Crusader soldiers spent the night tormented by thirst. They could see the Sea of Galilee in the distance, tantalizingly close but unreachable. Saladin's army surrounded them, lighting fires in the dry grass and taunting them through the darkness. At dawn on July 4th, the Muslims attacked in full force. Saladin's troops set fire to the dry scrub on the hillsides, and thick smoke rolled over the Crusader positions, choking men and horses alike. The infantry, desperate for water and blinded by smoke, broke formation and tried to fight their way toward the lake. They were cut down by the thousands. The knights made several charges trying to break through the Muslim encirclement. Each charge was met by a storm of arrows. Horses collapsed. Armoured men, already exhausted and dehydrated, found themselves surrounded and pulled from their mounts. By mid-afternoon it was over. The Crusader army had been annihilated. King Guy, Reynald of Châtillon, Gérard de Riedefort, and hundreds of knights were captured. The True Cross was seized by Saladin's soldiers and sent to Damascus as a trophy, paraded through the streets upside down in deliberate humiliation. Saladin ordered the prisoners brought to his tent. He offered King Guy a cup of water, a gesture of mercy under Islamic law that signalled the king's life would be spared. But when Guy passed the cup to Reynald, Saladin stopped him. He reminded Reynald of his crimes, his violations of truces, his attacks on pilgrims, his contempt for every convention of honourable warfare. Then Saladin drew his sword and personally beheaded him, fulfilling the vow he had made months earlier. The other prisoners watched in silence. The message was unmistakable. Mercy had limits. With the Crusader field army destroyed and its leadership in chains, the path to Jerusalem lay open. But Saladin knew that taking the holy city would require something more than military victory. It would require a demonstration of the very principles Reynald had so thoroughly rejected. In the aftermath of Hattin, the Crusader kingdom of Jerusalem collapsed with astonishing speed. The castles and fortified cities that had held the coast for nearly 90 years suddenly found themselves defenceless. Their garrisons had marched to Hattin and died there. The knights who had defended them were dead or captured. Saladin faced a choice that would define his legacy. He could storm each city, sack it in the traditional manner of medieval warfare, and take everything by force. Or he could offer terms that would make resistance seem pointless. He chose the latter, and the choice was both strategic and principled. Saladin offered each city the same terms: surrender peacefully, and the garrison and population would be allowed to leave unharmed with their possessions. Resist, and face a siege that would end in conquest and enslavement. It was a calculated form of psychological warfare. Each city that accepted the terms made the next city's decision easier, and Saladin knew that he did not have the time or resources to conduct long, bloody sieges of every fortified position on the coast. The first major city to fall was Acre, the most important port in the Crusader kingdom. It surrendered on July 10th, just 6 days after Hattin. The garrison was allowed to march out with their weapons and depart by sea. Jaffa, the ancient port city, fell soon after, then Sidon on the northern coast. Beirut, with its massive fortifications, surrendered without a fight. Ascalon, far to the south, held out briefly but capitulated in September. One by one, the cities that had been the economic and military backbone of the Crusader presence in the Levant opened their gates and submitted. The contrast with the Crusader conquest of these same cities in 1099 was stark and deliberate. When the armies of the First Crusade had captured Jerusalem, they had massacred the entire Muslim and Jewish population, slaughtering men, women and children in the streets and in the mosques where they had sought sanctuary. Contemporary accounts describe the Crusaders wading through blood. The atrocity had never been forgotten in the Muslim world, and many in Saladin's army expected and demanded similar vengeance now that the tables had turned. But Saladin refused. His mercy was partly strategic. Cities surrendered faster when they knew the population would be spared, but it was also rooted in genuine religious conviction. Islamic law had detailed rules governing warfare and the treatment of non-combatants. Massacring civilians was forbidden. So was looting cities that surrendered peacefully. Saladin adhered to these principles even when his own commanders questioned his generosity. Contemporary chronicles, including those written by Christian observers, note his visible exhaustion during this period and his repeated statements that he wanted the bloodshed to end as quickly as possible. By September of 1187, only two significant Crusader strongholds remained: the port city of Tyre in the far north and Jerusalem itself. Tyre managed to hold out due to the arrival of Conrad of Montferrat, an Italian nobleman who reached the city by sea just as Saladin's forces approached. Conrad organised the defences, rallied the population, and turned Tyre into a fortress that Saladin could not take without a prolonged and costly siege. Saladin chose to bypass it and turn his attention to the prize that mattered above all others: Jerusalem, the city where it all began, the city that had obsessed every Muslim ruler since its loss. Saladin stood before its walls in late September, knowing that the Christian world would never forgive him for what he was about to do. But there was no turning back now. The siege of Jerusalem began on September 20th, 1187. Saladin positioned his army around the city's western and northern walls, the most vulnerable sections of the fortifications. Inside, the defence was led by Balian of Ibelin, one of the few Crusader nobles to escape the disaster at Hattin. Balian had been in Tyre when the city fell under siege, and he had travelled to Jerusalem under a safe conduct from Saladin to evacuate his family. But when he arrived, the Patriarch of Jerusalem and the terrified population begged him to stay and organise the defence. Balian, honourable to a fault, sent a message to Saladin explaining the situation and asking to be released from his oath to leave. Saladin, respecting the impossible position Balian faced, agreed on the condition that Balian swear not to bear arms against him. Balian gave his word. Then he immediately broke it and began preparing Jerusalem's defences. The city's military situation was hopeless. There were almost no knights left. Balian knighted every nobleman's son old enough to hold a sword, creating 60 new knights in a desperate ceremony. The defence would rest on a civilian militia armed with whatever weapons could be found. The walls were strong, but walls required men to defend them, and Jerusalem did not have enough. Saladin's siege engines began battering the northern wall, and within days a section collapsed. Muslim troops poured toward the breach. They were driven back, but barely. It was clear that Jerusalem could not hold for long. Saladin sent envoys offering terms, unconditional surrender, and he would decide the fate of the population. It was the same offer he had made to other cities, but Jerusalem was different. This was the city that had been taken in an orgy of bloodshed 88 years earlier. Many in Saladin's army expected him to repay that massacre in kind. Balian rejected the offer and sent back a chilling counter-threat. If Saladin did not offer honourable terms, the defenders would kill every Muslim prisoner in the city, destroy every Islamic holy site including the Dome of the Rock and Al-Aqsa Mosque, and then fight to the death, taking as many attackers with them as possible. It was a threat born of desperation, but it was credible. Balian had nothing left to lose. Saladin paused. His advisors urged him to storm the city, to take it by force and let his soldiers have their vengeance. But Saladin was haunted by the memory of 1099 and conscious that the entire Islamic world was watching. He also understood that a massacre would stain his legacy and invite eternal Christian hatred. After consulting with his religious advisors, he agreed to negotiate. The final terms were announced on October 2nd. Every person in Jerusalem could ransom themselves. 10 dinars for each man, 5 dinars for each woman, 1 dinar for each child. Those who could pay would be free to leave with their possessions. Those who could not would be enslaved. On October 2nd, 1187, Saladin entered Jerusalem. The date was significant. It was the 27th day of Rajab in the Islamic calendar, the anniversary of the Prophet Muhammad's night journey, when he was believed to have ascended to heaven from the rock in Jerusalem. The symbolism was deliberate and powerful. Saladin rode through the streets to the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque, both of which had been used as Christian churches for nearly 90 years. He ordered them purified and rededicated. The golden cross that had been placed atop the dome of the rock was removed and sent to Damascus, dragged through the streets as the true cross had been months earlier. Christian chroniclers who witnessed the fall of Jerusalem recorded their shock at the absence of massacre and looting. There was no mass slaughter, no rampage through the streets. Saladin personally ransomed thousands of the poor who could not afford to pay. His brother Al-Adil requested 1,000 slaves as a gift, then freed them all. The Patriarch of Jerusalem, a man of immense personal wealth, paid his 10-dinar ransom and left the city carrying cartloads of gold and treasures from the churches, while the poor who could not pay were led away into slavery. It was a detail that did not escape notice. Saladin reportedly considered stopping the Patriarch and seizing the wealth to ransom more of the poor, but his advisors argued that it would violate the terms he'd offered. The Latin Christian population was given 40 days to evacuate. Some Eastern Christians, including Orthodox and Armenian communities, were allowed to remain. By early November, the transformation was complete. Jerusalem, the city that had defined the Crusades, was once again under Muslim control. Saladin had achieved the impossible, but in doing so he had guaranteed that all of Christendom would unite to take Jerusalem back, and they would send their greatest warriors to do it. News of Jerusalem's fall reached Europe in late October of 1187, carried by survivors who had made the dangerous sea journey from the Levant. The reaction was one of shock and grief that bordered on apocalyptic despair. Jerusalem, the holiest city in Christianity, the destination of countless pilgrims, the symbolic heart of Christendom's presence in the East, had fallen to the infidel. Pope Gregory VIII, who had been pope for less than 2 months, issued a papal bull titled Audita Tremendi, the dire news. It called for an immediate new crusade and proclaimed that Jerusalem's loss was divine punishment for the sins of Christian Europe. The Pope promised spiritual rewards for anyone who took up the cross and made the journey east to reclaim what had been lost. The response was unprecedented. 3 of the most powerful monarchs in Christendom took the cross and pledged to lead their armies to the Holy Land. Frederick I Barbarossa, the Holy Roman Emperor, was the first to commit. He was nearly 70 years old, a legendary warrior who had spent his long reign consolidating imperial power in Germany and Italy. Philip II of France, known as Philip Augustus, one of the shrewdest political operators in Europe, also took the cross. And finally, Richard I of England, called Coeur de Lion, the Lionheart, the warrior king whose reputation for personal bravery and tactical brilliance was already legendary, pledged to join the crusade. It was the largest coordinated military effort Christian Europe had mounted since the First Crusade nearly a century earlier. Saladin understood immediately what he had brought down upon himself. He had unified the Muslim Levant and reclaimed Jerusalem, achievements that had seemed impossible a decade earlier. But in doing so, he had provoked a response that threatened to destroy everything he had built. He spent the year 1188 fortifying coastal cities and preparing for the onslaught he knew was coming. He redistributed lands and titles to his sons and most trusted emirs, trying to ensure that his conquests would endure even if he fell. But his health, which had never been robust, was now failing noticeably. Contemporary sources describe repeated bouts of fever and exhaustion. He was 51 years old, an advanced age by the standards of the 12th century, and the last 20 years had been spent in almost constant warfare and campaigning. He began delegating more authority to his younger brother, Al-Adil, a capable and loyal administrator who had been Saladin's right hand throughout the campaigns. His sons, particularly Al-Afdal, the eldest, were given greater military responsibilities. But Saladin remained the unifying figure, the leader whose reputation and personal authority held the fragile coalition of emirs and regional powers together. In the summer of 1189, the vanguard of the new crusade arrived. An army of European knights and soldiers landed by sea and immediately laid siege to Acre, the great port city that had surrendered to Saladin 2 years earlier. Saladin marched his army to Acre and besieged the besiegers, trapping the Crusader force between his army and the city's garrison. It was a stalemate that would drag on for 2 years, a brutal war of attrition fought in the disease-ridden camps outside Acre's walls. Thousands died of illness for everyone who fell in combat. The siege became a grinding, miserable endurance contest that drained both sides. And then, in the spring of 1191, the news Saladin had been dreading arrived. Richard I of England had landed in the Holy Land. The Lionheart, the most feared warrior in Christendom, had finally come east, and with his arrival, the character of the war would change entirely. The siege of Acre would become a brutal 2-year stalemate, a war of disease and exhaustion. But Saladin was about to face a warrior unlike any he had ever encountered, a man whose name would be linked with his own for all of history. Richard I of England arrived at the siege of Acre in early June of 1191, and everything changed. He came by sea with a fleet of ships carrying English and French troops, fresh supplies, and the most advanced siege engines European craftsmen could build. Richard was 33 years old, in the prime of his physical power, and he had spent most of his adult life fighting wars in France. He was a tactical genius, personally brave to the point of recklessness, and utterly without mercy when he believed the situation demanded it. Contemporary chroniclers describe him as tall, with reddish blonde hair, a commanding voice, and a physical presence that dominated any room or battlefield he entered. His arrival electrified the demoralized Crusader forces, who had been trapped outside Acre's walls for nearly 2 years. Within weeks, Richard had reorganized the siege operations and intensified the bombardment of Acre's walls. His engineers assembled massive trebuchets that hurled stones and incendiary materials day and night. The garrison inside, weakened by disease and dwindling supplies, knew the end was near. Saladin, camped outside the Crusader lines, tried repeatedly to break through and relieve the city, but Richard's forces held firm. On July 12, 1191, Acre surrendered. The terms included the return of the true cross that had been captured at Hattin, the release of Crusader prisoners, and a ransom payment for the garrison. It was a devastating blow to Saladin. The greatest port on the coast was back in Crusader hands, and Richard now had a secure base of operations. The negotiations over the prisoners quickly broke down. Saladin delayed handing over the true cross and the promised ransom, perhaps hoping to stall Richard's advance, or perhaps because his treasury was genuinely too depleted to meet the terms. Richard, impatient and coldly pragmatic, responded with an act that shocked even his own allies. On August 20th, 1191, in full view of Saladin's army camped on the hills outside Acre, Richard ordered the execution of 2,700 Muslim prisoners. Men were marched out of the city and systematically slaughtered. It was a message written in blood. Richard would not be delayed, would not negotiate endlessly, and would not be bound by the rules that had governed Saladin's wars. Saladin's reaction was horror mixed with rage. He ordered the execution of his own Crusader prisoners in retaliation, though the numbers were far smaller. The two leaders, who would become forever linked in history and legend, never met face to face, but they understood each other with a terrible clarity. They communicated through envoys, through gifts exchanged during truces, and through the language of warfare itself. They were opposites in almost every way. Richard was the warrior king who led cavalry charges personally, who fought in the front lines, whose entire concept of leadership was bound up in visible, dramatic acts of physical courage. Saladin was the patient strategist, the careful planner who avoided pitched battles when possible, who preferred manoeuvre and negotiation to the brutal dice roll of combat. In early September of 1191, Richard began his march south from Acre toward Jaffa, intending to use the port as a staging ground for an eventual assault on Jerusalem. Saladin shadowed the Crusader army with his mounted archers, harassing the column constantly. On September the 7th, the armies clashed at Arsuf, halfway between Acre and Jaffa. Richard marched his troops in a tight defensive formation, infantry on the outside protecting the knights in the centre, archers interspersed to drive back Saladin's horsemen. For hours the Muslims attacked in waves, trying to break the formation. Richard held his knights back, refusing to allow them to charge prematurely. When he finally unleashed them in a coordinated counterattack, the impact was devastating. Saladin's forces were driven from the field, but it was not a decisive victory. The Muslim army retreated in good order and remained a threat. Richard won the battle but could not destroy his enemy. The chronicles from this period record a strange relationship of mutual respect. When Richard fell ill with a fever, Saladin sent him gifts of fresh fruit and ice brought down from the mountains, a gesture of chivalry that astonished the European knights. Messengers passed between the camps carrying proposals, counter-proposals, and personal messages between the two leaders. They were enemies locked in a war neither could afford to lose, but they recognized in each other a shared commitment to a code of honour that transcended the conflict. Richard's most legendary moment came in August of 1192 at the Second Battle of Jaffa. A Muslim army had recaptured the city, and Richard arrived by sea with a tiny force, perhaps 50 knights, and a few hundred infantry. Against all logic he landed on the beach and led a charge directly into the city. The chroniclers describe the scene in vivid detail. Richard in his armour, wielding a crossbow and sword, cutting through the defenders and retaking the city in a single chaotic assault. Days later, when Saladin's forces counterattacked, Richard personally led a cavalry charge with a handful of knights that drove back an army of thousands. According to legend, when Richard's horse was killed beneath him during the fight, Saladin sent him 2 fresh horses, refusing to allow such a warrior to fight on foot. Whether the story is true or embellished, it captures the strange mutual admiration that had developed between them. But neither man could deliver the final blow. Richard did not have the numbers to besiege Jerusalem and hold it against Saladin's armies. Saladin could not drive the Crusaders from the coastal cities that Richard now held. Both were exhausted, their armies depleted, their treasuries empty, and both faced crises at home that demanded their attention. By the summer of 1192, the Third Crusade had reached a point of mutual exhaustion that made further fighting pointless. Richard's army, though it had won every major battle, had been reduced by disease, desertion, and the constant attrition of Saladin's harassment campaigns. The English king faced a political crisis at home. His brother John was manoeuvring to seize the throne, and Richard's French territories were under threat from King Philip, who had abandoned the Crusade and returned to Europe months earlier. Every week Richard spent in the Levant increased the risk that he would lose his kingdom in Europe. Saladin's situation was equally dire. His army was exhausted from 3 years of continuous campaigning. The treasury was empty. He'd been forced to dismiss large portions of his forces because he could no longer pay them. The emirs who provided troops were growing restless, questioning how long they were expected to remain in the field. And Saladin himself, now 55 years old, was visibly unwell. Contemporary accounts describe his weight loss, his chronic fatigue, and the fevers that came and went with increasing frequency. Negotiations for a truce had been ongoing for months, conducted through intermediaries and messengers who travelled between the camps. The final terms were agreed upon on September 2nd, 1192, in the Treaty of Jaffa. The agreement was pragmatic and reflected the military stalemate. The Crusaders would retain control of the coastal strip from Tyre in the north to Jaffa in the south. Saladin and the Muslims would hold the interior, including Jerusalem. Christian pilgrims would be granted safe passage to visit the holy sites in Jerusalem, unarmed and in small groups. The truce would last for 3 years and 8 months. Neither leader was satisfied. Richard had come to reclaim Jerusalem and had failed. He had won brilliant victories, demonstrated extraordinary personal courage, and restored Crusader control of the coast, but the holy city remained in Muslim hands. For a man of Richard's temperament, it felt like failure. He reportedly wept when he learned that his advisers had convinced him not to attempt a siege of Jerusalem, knowing his forces were insufficient. As he sailed from Acre in October of 1192, he took an oath that he would return and finish what he had started. He never did. Within a few years he would be dead, killed by a crossbow bolt during a minor siege in France. Saladin returned to Damascus shortly after the treaty was signed. He entered the city quietly, without the triumphal processions that had marked earlier victories. Those close to him noted his exhaustion and his melancholy. He had held Jerusalem and prevented Richard from taking it, which was no small achievement. But he had failed to expel the Crusaders from the Levant entirely. The coastal cities they now controlled would serve as a foothold for future invasions. The dream of completely reversing the Crusader conquest remained unfulfilled. Contemporary chronicles describe Saladin in these final months of 1192 as a man who had aged rapidly. He had lost weight, and his once commanding presence seemed diminished. He spent long hours in private, often in prayer or in consultation with religious scholars. He spoke to his advisers about the need to fortify the interior cities and prepare for the inevitable renewal of hostilities when the truce expired. But there was a weariness in his voice that had not been there before. Saladin had spent his entire adult life in warfare. He had fought fellow Muslims for 12 years to build his empire, then fought the Crusaders for 5 more to defend it. Now, finally, there was peace. A fragile, temporary peace, but peace nonetheless. He would have only a few months to enjoy it before his body, worn down by decades of campaigning, began its final decline. When Saladin returned to Damascus in September of 1192, his administrators requested a meeting to review the state of his personal finances. It was a routine matter, the kind of bureaucratic accounting that any ruler needed to maintain. What they discovered shocked everyone in the room. Saladin's personal treasury contained less than 1 dinar of gold and 47 dirhams of silver. The total value would not have been enough to purchase a horse. It was certainly not enough to pay for a funeral, much less sustain a sultan. His sons, who attended the meeting, were stunned. They knew their father was generous, but this seemed impossible. Saladin ruled Egypt and Syria, the 2 wealthiest provinces in the Levant. Tribute flowed into Damascus from vassal cities and subject territories. The revenues from Egypt's agricultural lands alone were immense. Where had all the money gone? The answer lay in Saladin's systematic and relentless generosity. Every day, without fail, he held public audiences where anyone could approach and request aid. Beggars, widows, orphaned children, disabled soldiers, they came in steady streams, and Saladin turned almost no one away. He distributed coins from his personal funds, not from the state treasury. He provided stipends to religious scholars, funded the construction of madrasas where students could study Islamic law and theology, and patronized poets and artists. When soldiers completed their service, he often gave them bonuses beyond their contracted pay. When cities surrendered, he frequently compensated the inhabitants for property that had been damaged during sieges, even though he was under no obligation to do so. This was not mere political calculation. Though the generosity certainly enhanced his reputation, it was rooted in a deeply held religious conviction about the proper role of wealth. Saladin believed that wealth was a trust from God, a temporary stewardship rather than personal property. A ruler's duty, as he understood it, was to use that wealth for the benefit of his people, not to accumulate it for himself or his heirs. He lived simply, ate plain food, wore relatively modest clothing outside of ceremonial occasions, and owned almost no personal luxury items. The vast state treasuries under his control were spent on armies, fortifications, and public welfare. What little came to him personally he gave away. The contrast with other rulers of his era was stark. Most kings and sultans hoarded treasure, building up reserves of gold, jewels, and precious objects both as a display of power and as a hedge against future crises. Saladin did the opposite. His closest advisors repeatedly warned him that his generosity was unsustainable, that he needed to keep reserves for emergencies. He ignored them. When his sons expressed concern about their inheritance, he told them that a good name and a reputation for justice were worth more than gold. They would have to make their own fortunes. Contemporary sources record that beggars and petitioners knew they could find Saladin at his palace in Damascus almost every day. His doors were open in a way that was unusual for a ruler of his stature. He listened to complaints, settled disputes, and dispensed charity with a patience that his military commanders found baffling. This was the same man who could be ruthless in war, who had executed Reynald of Chatillon with his own hands, who had spent years fighting to consolidate power. But in peace, he chose to embody the Islamic ideal of the just and generous ruler. This extreme generosity had built his legend and earned him loyalty that mere military success could never have achieved. But it also meant that his sons would inherit an empire with no financial cushion, no accumulated wealth to sustain it through crisis. And unlike their father, they lacked the rare combination of military skill, political acumen, and moral authority that could inspire men to follow them without material reward. The winter of 1192 to 1193 was the first extended period of peace Saladin had known in more than 20 years. The Treaty of Jaffa held. The Crusaders remained on the coast, and Saladin's forces controlled the interior. For a man who had spent his entire adult life planning campaigns, moving armies, and negotiating alliances, the sudden absence of immediate military crisis was disorienting. Saladin established a routine in Damascus that seemed designed to reclaim a normal life he had never really had. He woke before dawn for the first of the 5 daily prayers required of Muslims. After the dawn prayer, he held a public audience in the great hall of the citadel, hearing petitions and settling disputes. The variety of cases was enormous: property disputes between merchants, complaints about corrupt officials, requests for financial aid, appeals for justice from widows and orphans. He listened to each case with careful attention, consulting with the qadis, the Islamic judges, when the law was unclear. By midday he would withdraw for private administrative work, reviewing reports from governors and military commanders, dictating letters, and consulting with his inner circle of advisers. But he also made time for pursuits that had been impossible during the wars. He spent hours with religious scholars discussing theology, Quranic interpretation, and Islamic jurisprudence. These were not political meetings, but genuine intellectual exchanges with men whose learning he respected. He took pleasure in the gardens of Damascus, walking through the orchards and along the channels of flowing water that made the city an oasis in an otherwise arid landscape. He had governed Damascus for nearly 20 years, but had barely seen it, always departing for the next campaign. He was reunited with family he had largely neglected. Saladin had 17 sons from various wives and several daughters. His household was large and complex, filled with children and grandchildren who barely knew him. His favourite was Al-Afdal, his eldest son, a young man in his early 20s. But Al-Afdal, though brave and loyal, lacked his father's political instinct and his ability to command loyalty from hardened warriors. The most capable member of the family was not one of Saladin's sons, but his younger brother Al-Adil, who'd been Saladin's most trusted lieutenant for decades. Al-Adil was in his 50s, a skilled general and a shrewd administrator. Everyone who understood the family dynamics knew that Al-Adil would likely emerge as the real power when Saladin died. Saladin knew this too. He understood that his empire, held together by his personal authority and reputation, would fragment without him. The various cities and provinces he controlled were governed by family members and loyal emirs, but their loyalty was to Saladin personally, not to the abstract idea of the Ayyubid dynasty. He should have formalized a succession plan, designated a clear heir, and used his remaining time to build consensus around that choice. But he could not bring himself to do it. Some historians suggest it was superstition, a belief that planning for death would hasten it. Others think he simply could not choose between his sons without creating resentment and division. Whatever the reason, he delayed, and the delay would prove costly. In January of 1193 he received a Frankish embassy, knights who had come to discuss the details of pilgrimage rites under the treaty. He greeted them with elaborate courtesy, provided them with gifts, and sent them away satisfied. His advisers, who had watched him empty his personal treasury yet again, warned him gently that he had nothing left to give. Saladin laughed. He told them that a man who died with gold in his coffers had wasted his life. In late February of 1193, word reached Damascus that a caravan of Muslim pilgrims returning from Mecca was approaching the city. Saladin, who made a practice of personally greeting important visitors, rode out to welcome them, despite the cold rain that had been falling all day. His servants urged him to wear a heavy cloak. He refused, saying the rain was not severe enough to warrant it. It was a small, inconsequential decision, the kind any person might make without thinking. But for Saladin, whose health was already fragile, it would prove fatal. Saladin returned to Damascus soaked and chilled from greeting the pilgrims. Within a day he developed a fever. At first it seemed like a minor ailment, the kind of illness that afflicts everyone occasionally and passes within a few days. But the fever did not break. Instead, it intensified. His physicians were summoned, and they began the treatments that 12th century medicine prescribed. Medieval Islamic medicine, like its European counterpart, was based on the theory of the 4 humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Illness was understood as an imbalance in these humours, and treatment focused on restoring equilibrium. Saladin's physicians diagnosed his condition as an excess of heated humours and prescribed bloodletting to draw off the surplus. They opened a vein and drained blood into a bowl. When the fever persisted, They tried herbal remedies, potions made from plants believed to have cooling properties. They adjusted his diet, forbidding rich foods and prescribing plain broths and water. None of it worked. Modern medical historians who have studied the contemporary accounts of Saladin's illness believe he most likely suffered from either typhoid fever, transmitted through contaminated water, or acute cholecystitis, an infection of the gallbladder. Both conditions can cause high fever, abdominal pain, and progressive weakness, and both were effectively untreatable with medieval medicine. Whatever the precise cause, it was clear within days that Saladin was seriously ill. His sons and his brother Al-Adil kept vigil at his bedside. The chronicler Baha ad-Din ibn Shaddad, one of Saladin's closest advisers and companions, was present throughout the illness and recorded detailed observations. He described Saladin alternating between moments of lucidity and periods of delirium. In his lucid moments, Saladin recited verses from the Quran, his voice weak but steady. He asked forgiveness from those he felt he had wronged, a ritual preparation for death that Islamic tradition encourages. He spoke to his sons, offering them advice about governing justly and maintaining unity, but he still refused to formally designate one of them as his successor. As the days passed, the fever worsened. Saladin's periods of consciousness grew shorter. Ibn Shaddad records that by early March, it was clear to everyone that he would not recover. The palace filled with a tense, grief-stricken silence. Emirs and officials who had served Saladin for decades waited in the outer chambers, hoping for good news that never came. Religious leaders were brought in to recite Quran verses over the dying Sultan. Saladin was moved to quieter chambers in the palace, where he could die in peace, away from the noise and activity of the main halls. On March 3rd, 12 days after the fever had begun, Saladin's breathing became laboured. His physician noted that his pulse was weak and irregular. His sons and Al-Adil were summoned. They gathered around his bed, along, with Ibn Shaddad and a Qadi who began reciting passages from the Quran in a low, steady voice. The end was near, and everyone in the room knew it. Dawn broke over Damascus on March the 4th, 1193. In a quiet chamber of the citadel, Saladin lay dying. His inner circle had gathered, his sons, his brother Al-Adil, his closest advisers, and a Qadi who sat near the bedside reciting from the Quran. The verses were chosen for their comfort and their reminder of God's mercy. Saladin's eyes were closed, his breathing shallow and uneven. He had not spoken in hours. The Qadi reached the Shahada, the fundamental declaration of Islamic faith. La ilaha illa Allah, there is no God but God. Ibn Shaddad, who recorded the scene, writes that at the sound of these words, Saladin's face softened. A faint smile appeared on his lips. The Qadi continued, "In him I trust." As the final syllable was spoken, Saladin's breathing stopped. The room fell silent. For a moment, no one moved. Then Al-Adil, Saladin's brother and the man who had stood beside him through decades of war, began to weep. The news spread through Damascus within the hour. Messengers carried word from the citadel to the city's mosques, markets, and residential quarters. The reaction was unprecedented. Markets closed spontaneously. People poured into the streets, not in celebration or riot, but in collective grief. Men who had never met Saladin personally wept openly. Women gathered in courtyards and homes to mourn. The Umayyad mosque filled with people praying for his soul. For a day, the normal rhythms of the city stopped entirely. When the officials came to prepare the body for burial, they made a discovery that shocked even those who had known about Saladin's generosity. There was no money in his personal treasury to pay for a burial shroud or a funeral. The Sultan, who had ruled Egypt and Syria, who had commanded armies numbering in the tens of thousands, who had recaptured Jerusalem and humbled the greatest warriors of Christendom, had died owning almost nothing. Al-Adil paid for the funeral expenses from his own funds. The funeral took place on March 5th. The procession moved through the streets of Damascus from the citadel to the Umayyad Mosque, one of the oldest and most sacred sites in the Islamic world. Thousands lined the route. The body was carried on a simple bier, covered in a plain white shroud. There was no elaborate coffin, no gilded decorations, no display of wealth or power. Saladin had left explicit instructions that his funeral should be humble. He was buried in a modest tomb in a garden adjacent to the mosque. There would be no grand mausoleum, no towering monument to his memory. The grave was marked with a simple stone. In his will, discovered after his death, Saladin had written that he wished to be remembered not for his conquests, but for his adherence to justice and his service to God. He instructed that any remaining wealth be distributed to the poor. He asked that his sons govern with mercy, and that they remember that all power is temporary, and all rulers are ultimately accountable to a higher authority. It was a final statement of the principles that had guided him, or at least the principles he believed should guide a ruler. The man was gone. The Kurdish soldier who had reluctantly followed his uncle to Egypt, who had become Vizier, then Sultan, who had unified a fractured Muslim world and reclaimed Jerusalem, who had faced Richard the Lionheart and fought him to a standstill, was dead at 55. His body lay in a simple grave, and the empire he had built with such effort now faced an uncertain future. The question that haunted everyone who had served him was painfully simple. Would his empire survive without him? Or would it fragment and collapse, undone by the same rivalries and divisions he had spent his life trying to overcome? The succession crisis began before Saladin's body was even in the ground. Within hours of his death on March 4th, 1193, the careful political structure he had built began to collapse. His eldest son, Al-Afdal, moved quickly to claim Damascus and declared himself Saladin's successor. His second son, Al-Aziz, controlled Egypt and had no intention of submitting to his brother's authority. The other sons, Al-Zahir in Aleppo, Al-Awhad in the Jazeera region, claimed their own territories and refused to acknowledge any supreme leader. The empire that Saladin had spent 20 years unifying splintered into rival principalities almost overnight. Watching all of this with cold calculation was Saladin's brother, Al-Adil. He was nearly 60 years old, a veteran of every major campaign Saladin had fought, and he understood power better than any of his nephews. Al-Adil did not immediately claim supremacy. Instead, he played the sons against one another, offering support to one and then switching allegiance to another, slowly manoeuvring himself into an indispensable position. He portrayed himself as the family's elder statesman, the voice of experience who could mediate disputes. In reality, he was systematically undermining each of his nephew's authority. By the year 1200, just 7 years after Saladin's death, Al-Adil had outmaneuvered them all. He took control of Egypt, the wealthiest province, and forced Al-Aziz into a subordinate position. When Al-Aziz died in 1204, Al-Adil simply absorbed his territories. Al-Afdal was pushed out of Damascus and given a minor city to govern. Al-Zahir held Aleppo, but only as Al-Adil's vassal. The other sons were reduced to governing small towns and fortresses. The unity that Saladin had forged through force of personality and military skill was gone. The empire was once again divided between Egypt and Syria, with Al-Adil ruling both but unable to truly integrate them. The Crusaders watched this fragmentation with satisfaction and relief. The Third Crusade's territorial gains, the coastal cities from Tyre to Jaffa, remained secure. The weakened and divided Ayyubid princes had neither the unity nor the resources to mount a serious campaign to reclaim them. When the Fourth Crusade was launched in 1202, it never even reached the Holy Land, diverting instead to attack Constantinople and establishing Latin control over the Byzantine Empire. The Crusader presence in the Levant, which had seemed so vulnerable after Hattin, stabilised and endured. The most devastating blow to Saladin's legacy came in 1229, just 36 years after his death. His nephew, Al-Kamil, who then ruled Egypt, faced pressure from a new crusade led by the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II. Rather than fight, Al-Kamil negotiated a treaty. He surrendered Jerusalem to Frederick without a battle, handing over the city that Saladin had died protecting in exchange for a 10-year truce. The terms allowed Muslims to retain control of the Dome of the Rock and Al-Aqsa Mosque, but the city itself was once again under Christian rule. The reaction in the Muslim world was shock and outrage. Chroniclers expressed their horror that Saladin's own family had given away what he had fought so hard to reclaim. Jerusalem would change hands again, retaken by Muslim forces in 1244, lost to the Mongols, reclaimed by the Mamluks, but the easy surrender of 1229 symbolised how completely Saladin's political achievement had unravelled. The unity he had imposed was temporary, sustained only by his personal authority. His military genius had reclaimed Jerusalem, but his dynasty could not hold it. Saladin's political legacy, it seemed, was fragile and fleeting. His empire had lasted barely a decade in unified form. His sons and nephews had squandered his achievements through rivalry and weakness. Yet even as the political structure crumbled, something unexpected was happening. Saladin's legend was growing, not just in the Muslim world where he was already revered, but among his former enemies in Christian Europe. Within decades of Saladin's death, he began appearing in European literature not as a villain, but as a hero. It was an extraordinary transformation. Medieval Christian chroniclers had spent the Crusades depicting Muslim leaders as barbaric infidels, enemies of God deserving only of destruction. Yet Saladin was treated differently. He was portrayed as the very model of chivalric virtue, a noble warrior whose honour and generosity transcended religious differences. The stories, many of them heavily embellished or entirely fictional, circulated throughout Europe. They told of Saladin's mercy to defeated enemies, his respect for Christian holy sites, his generosity to prisoners. One popular tale claimed that he had been secretly baptized as a Christian on his deathbed, a fantasy with no basis in fact, but one that allowed Christian audiences to reconcile their admiration for him with their religious worldview. Another story insisted that he had been knighted by a Christian king, creating a chivalric bond that explained his honourable conduct. These tales were repeated in courtly romances, the popular literature of medieval Europe, and Saladin became a stock character representing the ideal of the noble enemy. The most striking literary treatment came from Dante Alighieri in his Divine Comedy, written in the early 1320s. Dante placed Saladin in the first circle of hell, known as Limbo, reserved for virtuous pagans who lived before Christ or outside the Christian faith through no fault of their own. Saladin is grouped with the great philosophers and heroes of antiquity, Aristotle, Socrates, Julius Caesar, and others. For a medieval Christian poet to place a Muslim sultan in the same category as the foundational figures of Western civilization was an extraordinary compliment. Dante positioned Saladin higher in the moral hierarchy than many Christians who populate the deeper, more punishing circles of hell. This idealization served a psychological need for Christian Europe. The loss of Jerusalem in 1187 had been a profound shock and humiliation. The Third Crusade, despite Richard's tactical brilliance, had failed to reclaim the Holy City. If Saladin was a barbaric monster, then the defeat was shameful. How could Christendom's greatest warriors be bested by someone unworthy? But if Saladin was noble, chivalrous, and honourable, then the defeat became acceptable. To lose to a worthy opponent was no disgrace. Saladin's virtue elevated the conflict and made the Crusaders' failure easier to bear. The contrast with how other Muslim leaders were portrayed is striking. Baybars, the Mamluk Sultan, who inflicted devastating defeats on the Crusaders in the 13th century, was depicted in European sources as cruel and treacherous. Zengi, Saladin's predecessor, was described as a bloodthirsty tyrant. But Saladin was different. His decision to spare the population of Jerusalem in 1187, so starkly contrasting with the Crusaders' massacre of 1099, created a foundation of moral authority that European chroniclers could not ignore. Even his enemies acknowledged that he had acted with a mercy and restraint that shamed Christian conduct. The legend Saladin acquired in Christian Europe was selective and simplified, stripping away the political ruthlessness, the wars against fellow Muslims, the calculated strategy behind his generosity. It created an idealized figure who never fully existed. But the fact that it happened at all, that medieval Christians chose to honor a Muslim enemy rather than demonize him, speaks to the profound impact he had on those who encountered him, either directly or through the stories that spread across Europe. Yet as powerful as the Christian legend became, it was in the Muslim world that Saladin's memory would take on even greater significance, transforming him from a historical figure into a timeless symbol of unity and resistance. In the Islamic world, Saladin's reputation in the immediate aftermath of his death was more complex than the later legend would suggest. Medieval Muslim chroniclers praised his piety, his generosity, and his success in reclaiming Jerusalem, but they did not shy away from criticism. Some noted that he had spent more years fighting fellow Muslims than fighting Crusaders. Others questioned the legitimacy of his rise to power, pointing out that he had usurped the Zengid dynasty he had sworn to serve. His military genius was acknowledged, but so was the political ruthlessness that had allowed him to build his empire. He was seen as a great man, but a human one, with flaws and contradictions. This nuanced view began to shift dramatically in the 19th and 20th centuries during the period of European colonialism. As European powers carved up the Middle East and North Africa, establishing direct or indirect control over Muslim-majority lands, nationalist movements searched for historical symbols of resistance and unity. Saladin, who had united Egypt and Syria and expelled foreign invaders, became an irresistible icon. He was reinterpreted as the model of the leader who could overcome division and defeat Western aggression. Gamal Abdel Nasser, the Egyptian president who led the Arab nationalist movement in the 1950s and 60s, invoked Saladin explicitly and repeatedly. Nasser saw himself as Saladin's heir, a leader who would unite the Arab world and resist Western imperialism, just as Saladin had united the Muslims and resisted the Crusaders. The comparison was powerful propaganda, linking Nasser's political project to a glorious past. Statues of Saladin were erected in Cairo and Damascus. His image appeared on stamps, currency, and in state-sponsored media. The complex, contradictory historical figure was simplified into a symbol of Arab unity and anti-colonial resistance. Hafez al-Assad, the Syrian dictator who ruled from 1970 to 2000, also claimed Saladin's legacy. Assad belonged to the Alawite minority, a sect of Islam that many Orthodox Sunnis did not even recognize as Muslim, yet he presented himself as the defender of Arab and Islamic honor. He had Saladin's tomb in Damascus renovated in the 1990s, turning it into a pilgrimage site and a tourist attraction. The tomb had been restored once before in 1898 by the German Kaiser Wilhelm II during a state visit. A bizarre episode in which a Christian emperor paid homage to a Muslim sultan as a gesture of respect and political symbolism. Saddam Hussein, the Iraqi dictator, also invoked Saladin, emphasizing that both men were born in Tikrit. Saddam commissioned murals, statues, and propaganda films that drew explicit parallels between himself and the medieval sultan. The comparison was absurd to anyone familiar with Saladin's actual character. Saladin's generosity and restraint bore no resemblance to Saddam's brutality, but it was politically useful. Even today, various groups and leaders across the Muslim world invoke Saladin's name when calling for unity or resistance, often stripping away the historical context entirely. The real Saladin was pragmatic, often willing to negotiate truces with Crusaders when it served his interests. He was generous but also calculating. His jihad was as much about political consolidation as religious duty. The modern symbol, by contrast, is simplified and idealized, reduced to a slogan or an image that can be deployed for whatever cause needs historical legitimacy. The gap between the man and the myth has never been wider. Saladin's tomb in Damascus remains a site of pilgrimage for those who can reach it. The structure has been destroyed and rebuilt multiple times over the centuries. Its current status is uncertain due to the ongoing Syrian civil war, which has devastated Damascus and much of the country. Whether the tomb has been damaged or remains intact is unclear, but even if the physical monument were to be completely destroyed, Saladin's memory would endure. Monuments can be rebuilt or forgotten, but legends, once established, take on a life of their own. Beyond the politics and the propaganda, beyond the statues and the speeches, there remains the human story, the life of Yusuf ibn Ayyub, a man who rose from obscurity to change the world and then died owning nothing. What can we learn from his life? Saladin was a man of profound contradictions, and it is those contradictions that make his story so compelling. He was genuinely pious, praying 5 times a day without fail throughout his entire adult life, fasting during Ramadan even during military campaigns, and consulting religious scholars on matters of law and ethics. His letters and the accounts of those who knew him suggest that his faith was sincere, not merely a political tool. Yet he was also ruthlessly political. He usurped the dynasty of the man who had given his family everything. He fought wars against fellow Muslims for 12 years to consolidate power, justifying the bloodshed in the name of eventual unity, but undeniably pursuing personal ambition. He was merciful to his enemies in ways that astonished medieval observers. He spared the population of Jerusalem when he could have massacred them. He treated captured Crusader kings and nobles with honour. He sent gifts to Richard when the English king fell ill. Yet he could also be harsh and unforgiving. He personally executed Reynold of Châtillon and showed no mercy to those he considered oath-breakers or threats to his authority. His generosity was legendary. He died penniless, having given away everything. But was that generosity purely principled, or was it also a calculated strategy to build loyalty and enhance his reputation? The answer is almost certainly both. Human motivations are rarely pure. The cost of his greatness was enormous. He spent 40 years in almost continuous warfare, either fighting or preparing to fight. He barely knew his own children, having been absent for most of their lives. His health was ruined by the constant stress and physical demands of campaigning. His letters from later in life express exhaustion and a longing for peace that he never truly found. He achieved immortal fame, but at what price? Was he happy? The sources suggest he was not. He carried the weight of his responsibilities with a grim determination, driven by duty and faith rather than joy. His life offers lessons about leadership that remain relevant. Unity, he understood, requires both force and legitimacy. Force alone breeds resentment and rebellion. Legitimacy alone, without the power to enforce it, is hollow. Saladin wielded both, using military strength to impose order and religious rhetoric to justify it. But he also knew that loyalty could not be purchased only with fear. His generosity, his accessibility, and his personal piety built a different kind of loyalty, one rooted in respect and admiration. When he died, men wept not because they feared his successor, but because they genuinely mourned him. His understanding of jihad was also instructive, particularly in contrast to how the term is often distorted today. For Saladin, jihad was not indiscriminate violence or terrorism. It was a legal and religious framework for defending Muslim lands and reclaiming what had been lost. He adhered to Islamic laws of warfare that forbade the killing of non-combatants, required the honouring of treaties, and demanded mercy to those who surrendered. Modern groups that invoke his name while violating every principle he upheld betray his legacy more thoroughly than any enemy ever could. The ultimate irony of Saladin's life is that he is remembered primarily for taking Jerusalem, yet his mercy in that moment mattered far more than the conquest itself. Conquests are reversed, cities change hands, but the choice to show restraint when vengeance was expected, to uphold principles when brutality would have been easier, that resonates across centuries. It is the decision that made him a legend in both the Christian and Muslim worlds. And so we return to where we began. The walls of Jerusalem in 1187, the moment that defined him and continues to define how we remember him more than 800 years later. Jerusalem, the city at the heart of Saladin's life, the obsession that drove him, the triumph that crowned his career, and the legacy that outlived his empire. On October 2nd, 1187, Saladin stood at the gates of the Holy City and made a choice that would echo through history. He could have allowed his soldiers to take vengeance for the massacre of 1099. He could have matched the Crusaders' brutality and erased the Christian presence in a wave of retaliatory bloodshed. Instead, he chose mercy. He ransomed the population, allowed them to leave, and rededicated the city's holy sites without the mass slaughter that many on both sides expected. It was his greatest triumph, but the dream that sustained him, that Jerusalem would remain under Muslim control, a permanent reconquest that would reverse the humiliation of the Crusades, was never realised. The city's history since his death is a chronicle of constant struggle and changing hands. Just 36 years after Saladin's death, in 1229, his own nephew surrendered Jerusalem to the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II in a negotiated treaty, giving away what Saladin had died protecting. The Muslim world was appalled, but the city was lost. It was retaken in 1244 by Khwarezmian forces allied with the Egyptian Sultanate, only to fall again decades later. In 1517, the Ottoman Turks conquered Jerusalem, and it remained under Ottoman rule for 4 centuries, a stability that Saladin would have envied but never achieved. The Ottomans governed the city as part of their vast empire, allowing Christians and Jews to live and worship there under the millet system that granted religious minorities a degree of autonomy. The Ottoman period ended in 1917, when British forces captured Jerusalem during the First World War. General Edmund Allenby famously entered the city on foot, a gesture of respect that contrasted with the triumphal entries of conquerors past. The British mandate over Palestine followed, a period of rising tensions between Jewish and Arab communities that culminated in the United Nations Partition Plan of 1947. When the State of Israel was established in 1948, Jerusalem was divided. The western part became Israel's capital. The eastern part, including the Old City with its sacred sites, was controlled by Jordan. The city was reunified under Israeli control in 1967 during the Six-Day War, when Israeli forces captured East Jerusalem and the Old City. Since then, the status of Jerusalem has remained one of the most contested and emotionally charged issues in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and in the broader Middle East. It is claimed as a capital by both Israelis and Palestinians. It is sacred to 3 faiths: Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. The Dome of the Rock and Al-Aqsa Mosque, The sites Saladin rededicated in 1187 still stand. The western wall, sacred to Jews, is just metres away. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre, built over the site where Christians believe Jesus was crucified and buried, draws pilgrims from around the world. Saladin's dream of permanent Muslim sovereignty over Jerusalem was never realised. The city has changed hands more times since his death than anyone could count. Yet his legacy transcends the politics of possession. What endures is not the fact that he took the city, but how he took it. On October 2nd, 1187, he chose mercy over vengeance. He created, even if only briefly, the possibility of coexistence. He demonstrated that a city sacred to multiple faiths did not have to be drenched in blood with every change of power. Modern conflicts continue to invoke Saladin's name, but too often they ignore his restraint. Leaders and movements claim his legacy while pursuing strategies that would have horrified him. The man was better than the myth. He was calculating, yes, and ambitious, but he was also guided by principles that limited his actions, even when brutality would have been easier or more profitable. The warrior who showed mercy. The Sultan who owned nothing. The legend who was, in the end, simply human. His tomb in Damascus, that modest structure in the garden by the Umayyad Mosque, faces an uncertain future in a country torn apart by civil war. Whether it still stands intact, no one can say with certainty. But Saladin's memory endures beyond monuments. On quiet nights in Damascus, they say you can still hear the call to prayer from the Umayyad Mosque, the same call that echoed through the city when Saladin walked its streets. And in that sound is the echo of a man who changed the world, not by being perfect, but by striving, in his imperfect and thoroughly human way, to be just. Before we close, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. It truly helps this work continue, and I'd love to know, what is your main takeaway from Saladin's story? What aspect of his life resonated most with you? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. Saladin died at 55, penniless and exhausted. His empire fragmented within years of his death, torn apart by the rivalries of sons and nephews who lacked his ability to inspire loyalty. Yet more than 830 years later, we still speak his name, not because of the cities he conquered, but because of how he conquered them. Not because he was a perfect man, he was not, but because he strove to live by principles that transcended mere ambition. He was a warrior who chose mercy when vengeance was expected. He was a sultan who gave away everything and died owning nothing. He was a legend who remained, even at the height of his power, deeply and recognizably human. Jerusalem endures, still contested, still claimed by multiple faiths, still the center of conflicts that Saladin would recognize even across the gulf of centuries. The issues he grappled with, how to balance faith and politics, how to wield power justly, how to make peace with enemies without betraying principles, remain unresolved. Perhaps they always will be. But his example, flawed and incomplete as it was, offers a vision of what leadership grounded in both strength and mercy might look like. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the life of Saladin, the Kurdish soldier who became a sultan and a legend. It has been a true pleasure to be your guide through the story of this complex, contradictory, and utterly remarkable man. Until our next journey into the past, I wish you a calm and peaceful night.